that's President Trump really telling it like it is. You know, he's not sugarcoating it at all. It is a significant development because there was real hope that this round of ceasefire talks would work. That's why Steve Witkoff went to Rome and then Doha. That's why Ron Dermer was involved. And Steve Witkoff himself said he wasn't even going to participate or travel if they weren't actually going to be serious. But things started to look a little bit hairy earlier this week when Hamas responded initially to this latest ceasefire proposal with demands apparently that were so absurd that the Egyptians and Qataris told Hamas to go back and come back with new demands because they weren't even going to present them to the Israelis. And so from the beginning, we see that. But it's, you know, Trump put it very succinctly. And the fact is that Hamas is standing on its last leg. And there's a pro and a con with that when you're talking about negotiations, because on one hand, they want to survive, and the only bargaining chip they have left are the remaining hostages. So on one hand, you kind of have them by the neck against the wall. But on the other hand, that's why they want the ceasefire talks to include a permanent end to the war, because that's the only thing that's going to assure their survival. And if they give up hostages, they know that that 60-day window that this ceasefire would have given likely wouldn't have reached an end of the war, because Israel and Ron Dermer himself has said this publicly numerous times, that the goal ultimately is to obliterate Hamas completely. Its military capabilities, its ability to govern Gaza, and Hamas knows that. And that's why ultimately, no matter what you do, Hamas is not going to want to make a deal that doesn't include a permanent end to the war.
So, Hagar, if that's the backdrop here and what ultimately perhaps led to this blow to the negotiations, how do the parties regroup from here? Is this the end of diplomatic talks? How do they get this back on track?
Well, so I've heard some people call it an earthquake when the U.S. in particular walked out. And I would agree that that's a big earthquake because they've been negotiating for months. And Trump, in his statement today, he said also, he said, this is just Hamas wants to die. They're asking to die. And for the Israeli government, by the way, where you have a set policy and strategy set out by Netanyahu and the cabinet to completely obliterate Hamas, this is basically the go-ahead as well, right? But to finish off the job in Gaza, which is what Trump said. And so it's not impossible for talks to start up again. The Israelis have said that if Hamas comes back to the table with demands that are negotiable, they said, by the way, that those demands were related to the number of Palestinian prisoners that Hamas wanted released. I also know separately that a lot of the sticking points had to do with the extent to which the Israeli army withdrew from certain areas, that Hamas wanted them to withdraw even further. And so, you have, like, as with any negotiation, those final sticking points. It's not impossible, but it's certainly a blow, and I would expect the Israeli government to amp up its efforts again in Gaza at this point.
Enter Emmanuel Macron. I want to ask you what the French are doing here, Hagar, and if it matters. As we reported yesterday, the French say they will recognize a Palestinian state, the first Western nation, the first of the G7 to do so, and will do that before the UN Security Council. President Trump, Hagar, was asked about that in the same romp with reporters this morning, referring to Macron. He said, quote, "Here's the good news. What he says doesn't matter," unquote. Is Donald Trump right?
Yes, I mean, to put it very bluntly, and as you know, I tell it like it is, the French are making dumb moves. And it's true, in the world of geopolitical power, if we are very honest with ourselves, the entire world could recognize a Palestinian state. And if the U.S. doesn't, and if Israel doesn't, then it doesn't really mean much at the end of the day, because you need those two to recognize a Palestinian state for that state to actually exist the way it needs to. Now, again, I am not a proponent, by the way, of the status quo. I think the status quo is awful. I am myself a two-stater. I always have been. And I actually would even go, by the way, on this point, and as you know, I tend to be quite hawkish when it comes to my foreign policies. But on this point, I tend to lean quite liberal, and I believe that you could recognize a Palestinian state at the outset, even, of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, meaning talks between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. But doing it at this time only sends one message, and that message is that violent resistance can be rewarded. That after a while, and after pressure, and after screaming, and after pursuing October 7th, and after having movements around the world where they're calling to globalize the Intifada, that yes, you can win and have a Palestinian state. But at the end of the day, what does it mean? We don't know the borders. We don't know what it would look like. No one else is going to recognize it the way a state should be recognized. And on top of it, for the French to do it simultaneously while releasing a convicted murderer He was a Lebanese individual. His name is George Abdullah, who was convicted for murdering an Israeli diplomat and U.S. military official 40 years ago in France on the supposed pro-resistance, pro-Palestinian movement. They released him today. He went back to Lebanon. He received an embarrassing welcome parade, and to do that on the same day only reinforces that message. So if the French goal was to say, hey, we want to move forward and we want a Palestinian state, I'm not against that goal. But to do it at this time in the middle of a war with no strategy attached just comes off like all talk without any goal actually achieved.
Well, I want to actually build on this, too, and this broader idea about allies when they do put pressure, perhaps, on the U.S. What does that do to the U.S.-Israel relationship when you see France come out with a decision like this? When we're talking about the broader policy here, does that perhaps actually bolster the U.S. in the other way? I'd love your perspective on sort of the dynamic that we see emerge.
Yes, I would argue that it would bolster it the other way. In fact, you've seen, right, throughout these several months, or even if you look back to October 7th, too, the U.S.-Israeli relationship has only become stronger. But if you look at just the last few months where there have been these suspicions that, the U.S.-Israel relationship is strained, things between Netanyahu and Trump have been strained, I think that really couldn't be farther from the truth. And we're seeing that play out over and over again. Where this could undermine alliances and relationships is actually among the UN Security Council membership, the G7, the U.S.-French relationship. I mean, Trump, he said it, again, he doesn't sugarcoat it, right? He says it like it is. And he said about Macron, he said, I like the guy, but what he said doesn't matter. And this isn't going to do anything. And I agree with that. So I don't think that this is going to undermine the U.S.-French relationship so much so that you see this big chasm. But I will tell you, for U.S. efforts to pursue peace in the region, with this kind of move, the French are not going to be involved. And that's something the French president has to think about, because he is trying to be relevant. He's trying to find a place for himself and for the French government in moving forward on the Middle East. And doing this kind of move just makes it look like they're not coordinated and that they're on the outs. And so the French really stand to lose a lot with this move, in my view. It might undermine things in particular with the U.S. and France, but I certainly don't think it'll undermine the U.S.-Israel relationship. As you said, on the contrary, it'll only bolster it.
Heard from Steve Witkoff, the president's envoy to the Middle East, of course, among other things. He says Hamas does not appear to be coordinated or acting in good faith. Is that actually true?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a terrorist organization. So, of course, they're not going to act in good faith. And that's always the case, right? They're always dragging their feet. And that's going to be the case whether you're negotiating, by the way, with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with the Iranian regime. And fundamentally, that's because we have to understand their goals. Hamas, at the end of the day, and they state it over and over again, is to have an Islamist caliphate where you have the state of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And their goal is to kill Jews and Americans. In fact, you have two militants just this week who went out to say that after they succeeded that the next thing would be that they're going to kill Christians and Americans next. This is what Hamas is. So how really can you negotiate in good faith? At the end of the day, when you have negotiations, every party is going to have their goals, and their goals are always going to be very different. In this case, they're completely contradictory, because Hamas just wants to survive, and the Israeli government has made it very clear that they cannot, following October 7. So you're going to have that. But the process with any negotiation is finding something that other side wants that you can give, so that you can try to get closer to your goal. And it's very hard to see how you're going to bridge that gap with this effort as you get closer and closer to a situation where Hamas loses all of the hostages, right? That's the only reason Hamas has any leg to stand on left. It's because of those hostages. But no, I absolutely agree. Of course, they haven't negotiated in good faith this entire time, and they never will, and they never did. But I really do think that they are writing their names in the tombstones. The problem is that Hamas, unlike any other fighting machine, is putting its civilians in front of them as their shield. And so, unfortunately, I think that I really do expect things to get worse over the next few months. Unfortunately, it's really unfortunate. Wow. I really wish that weren't the case. But I see that's the only way it's going to go.